Hi guys, welcome to Inclusive Teaching. I hope you're having a great summer and enjoying the class. I decided this summer that I was going to attempt to video my thoughts about your discussions for the week instead of trying to respond to each one of you. I've figured out that when I respond to each one of your discussions, I tend to just keep repeating myself over and over and over again, which I'm sure is boring for you. And doesn't seem like the best idea. So today I've kind of looked at all of your posts, pulled together some of the common thoughts, and I'm going to try to do it this way and see what you think. First, I want to talk to you about the purpose of the discussion boards. I know this course has a lot of reading and a lot of discussion boards, and I want you to think about the discussion boards from my perspective is that you're talking to each other. So in my classes face-to-face, I'm all about conversation and discussion because you'll notice in special education we have a lot of topics that are controversial, that have a lot of pros and a lot of cons, and everyone has different perspectives. It depends on where you're coming from. So in this course particularly, there's a lot of different perspectives. When you think about inclusion of students with disabilities, it can be controversial. It has been controversial. We don't have a lot of research to say what does and does not work with inclusion. We have some, but not a lot, especially with students with behavioral disorders, which is my area of expertise. I've done some research recently where we've tried to look at the research and figure out what do we know about working with students with EBD in inclusive settings, and what we've found is we don't know a lot. So as we talk through this course and you guys talk to each other, you're going to learn from each other, you're going to learn from the course materials, and hopefully that's how it'll work. You'll also find out that the best teachers experience and each other. Everyone in this course comes from a different place, and I noticed in your post that we have a large, diverse population. We have parents of students with disabilities, and we have a sister of a child with a disability, and we have teachers from early elementary all the way through high school biology. I'm also going to mention some names as I talk about things that you've said. If I don't mention your name this week, rest assured I will before the summer's over. I just wanted to give a shout out to Loma, Christine, and Colleen, who are all parents of students with disabilities, and Aaron, who has a brother with a disability. As far as experience goes, we have teachers, like I said a minute ago, who have worked pre-K all the way through high school, and we also have Caitlin, who teaches in an alternative school. Hey, Caitlin. So all these perspectives bring together what we know. So read all the posts. That's what it's all about, learning from each other. Let's see what else I have on here. So let me start with the syllabus discussion and some of the questions you guys had about the syllabus and the activities for the course. There were some questions about when your initial post was due. So it's best if you can post your initial post by Wednesday so that your classmates can have an opportunity to respond to your post. So you need to post one original post and then respond to each topic, each discussion at least once. So that'll give you the opportunity to do that if everyone posts by Wednesday. The rubrics and for all the assignments are in the assignment folder. I know that some of you were struggling to find the assignment folders. So if you look on the left in Canvas at the bottom, there's 3 different assignment folders. So there's assignment 1, assignment 2, and assignment 3. Within those folders, there are rubrics and discussions. Some of you have emailed me because there's different information in different places, and I'm great with that. So if you get confused, please feel free to email me. For the technology project, you need to upload your technology presentation to the discussion board so that your classmates can comment on your technology project. And to be honest with you, this is one of the things that you will really take away from this course that will really help you when you're teaching. If I was taking this course, I would build a notebook with all of the different technology presentations and how to use it and how to find those things. Because I think when we work with students with disabilities in gen ed settings, it's really beneficial to tap into the available technology. So upload your PowerPoint or your presentation to the discussion board, and then the Word doc you will actually upload in the assignment folder. So you'll find the technology assignment folder and upload your Word document, and I will grade both of those things. The other thing that's I often get questions about in this course is partnership work, which is kind of an interesting thing to do in an online course, but I think it's really beneficial. As I talked a minute ago about your diverse experiences and where you're coming from, I think it's really beneficial to work in partners. So I think some of you have already found partners. If you look at the way people are starting to talk on the discussion boards, or if you go back and look at the introduction PowerPoints, you'll find people that you have things in common with and you think you want to work with. How do you do that? That's a question that I get often. So how do you do that? You reach out to each other on the discussion boards. You can work through a Google Doc. You can pass documents back and forth. You can physically meet if you want to, but that's not necessary. You can do everything online with technology the way it is today. And I think it's fun. So you need a partner for the behavior support plan and for the differentiated unit plan. So you'll turn it in as one assignment with both names on it. It's really important to me that you put both names on all of your assignments and that you actually put your name on the assignment. Don't assume that I'm going to know who it is just by the title of the file. What else did you guys ask me about? I guess that's pretty much that. Oh, quizzes and the final exam are both open book. However, there is a time limit, so you're going to have to know the information well enough to be able to answer the questions without going back and looking through all of your notes. It was really nice to meet you guys via your PowerPoint presentations with your PowerPoint presentations. I love learning about your families, your pets, your travel. Those are the things that are really important during summer, and they help me remember that it's not really all about teaching, because that's what we tend to do, right? As teachers, we tend to overwhelm ourselves with teaching and forget that there are other parts of life. So it's really fun for me to see you guys talk about those things. I wanted to give a shout out to Colleen. Hi, Colleen. It was interesting hearing that you're a military wife. I was a military wife for a couple of really tense years. My husband was in reserve, so I guess I was a military wife until he retired. But when he was deployed to Iraq, I think in 2004, I became a full-time military wife. So I have some idea of what your life has been like, probably the most stressful components of it. So it was really nice to see that that you're out there and you've had different experiences. Caitlin, I wanted to tell you that students with EBD are my favorite. Also, they're fun to teach. They're challenging, but that's so rewarding, right? I think it's important, before I start talking about your post, for you guys to recognize the wealth of knowledge that you have from each other. Caitlin teaches at an alternative school for students with disabilities, so she brings a completely different perspective to this class than someone that taught a second grade class, for example, with just a second grade inclusion class. And so read each other's posts and think about where you're coming from. In my face-to-face classes, I do a lot of discussion with critical thinking and just think about things, reflect on yourself, your thoughts, your feelings, and do that through your post and read other people's posts also. So what I wanted to talk to you tonight as far as your discussion boards go is that we talked about the pros and cons of inclusive teaching. And a lot of you guys came up with some very good pros and cons. A lot were very much the same across people, which tells me that within the field we haven't learned to address a lot of those cons, which bothers me. Like I said earlier, we need the research to talk about how do we make this happen, because it's happening, whether we want it to or not. Let me start by telling you a little bit about my philosophy of inclusion, just so that you know where I'm coming from. And remember again that it's important to me that we all have our own opinions, that we learn from the reading, we learn from the videos, and we learn to grow and reflect on our thoughts. But nonetheless, we all have our feelings, right? And our perceptions. So my perception of inclusion is that it's important, and that it's happening regardless of whether we think it's a great idea or not. Remember that I worked with students with emotional and behavioral disorders, and that is my area of expertise. And inclusion for kids with EBD is a whole different ballgame than inclusion of students with like learning disabilities, or even, yeah, especially with students with learning disabilities. And regardless of the disability, it's different depending on the individual child. And a lot of you guys talked about the importance of remembering that individual in IEP, which I always go back to. I wanted to talk a little bit about that before I talk about what you said. Within the least restrictive environment, several of you referenced the least restrictive environment, and I think it's important to remember that what the law says is that children should be educated with their non-disabled peers to the greatest extent appropriate. That doesn't mean all children have to be in a general education setting. The law does encourage us to educate students with disabilities, with students without disabilities to the greatest extent appropriate. But it's important to remember that what least restrictive environment means is individual for each child. So if it's the least restrictive environment for one student, for Johnny, let's just talk about Johnny. Let's say Johnny has severe behavioral disorders, and he has a severe behavioral disorder. When I taught Johnny. I talk about Johnny a lot. He actually has a different name, but I talk about Johnny. When Johnny worked his way out of my classroom and worked into a general education classroom, he was not successful. It was not his least restrictive environment. The least restrictive environment is where he could be successful, which was in a self-contained classroom with a leveling system and a point system and really stringent behavior policies, contracts, reinforcers. And he understood that, and it really helped him. He needed that structure that he was not going to get in a general education setting. So that was his least restrictive environment. And that's what the law says. There's been a huge push for us to move kids into inclusive settings over the last 10, 20 years. And that has to do with, I'm sure as you've read, that has to do with a lot of things. Highly qualified teachers. So if you have a child with a disability in an English classroom, then that teacher needs to be certified in English and special education. So if you put an English teacher and a special education teacher together, you've met that requirement. So that has a lot to do with it. The other thing is that there are people that believe, and some of you guys talked about this, in full inclusion. There are people that believe that full inclusion is the best environment for students with disabilities, and that's their right? But I think it's really important that we remember what LRE is. Recently, there was a Supreme Court case where they talked about how much progress students with disabilities need to make, and that's important when you're considering placement. So when the child study team is talking about placement, you want to pick the placement where the student can make the most progress. For a while, there was a court case that we depended on that said that students had to make meaningful progress, and then they talked about what meaningful progress meant, which is kind of a vague term. So recently, in 2017, there was a court case, a Supreme Court case, where it was Andrew versus Douglas County School District, and the term changed from the term changed from meaningful progress to appropriately ambitious progress. Again, court cases will have to kind of work through exactly what that means. But when you think about inclusion, think about where the student can make that kind of progress. And that's what's important, right? Yeah, and I think Caitlin wrote, we often acquire students with, okay, Caitlin speaking about an alternative, very structured and not inclusive setting, wrote, we often acquire students who have been in schools for weeks, months, or even entire semesters, have been out of school for weeks, months, or even entire semesters due to parents not having the resources or ability to advocate for their child. It's important. That's really important to think about, because if the student can't function in a general education classroom with all the supports the school can provide, then it's not the least restrictive environment. So Caitlin, you're right. The other thing is that it's really important to teach our parents how to advocate for their children with disabilities. Okay, so back to pros and cons. So some of the pros that you guys talked about, if you noticed across the postings, a lot of you guys talk about the same pros and cons, which is typical for all of my classes and also typical for the reading you're going to do. Again, we notice the pros and we want to maximize on those pros, but we have to figure out how to deal with the cons. And that's part of this class. So you'll learn a lot about how to work through some of the problems that you've had. So some of the pros, Loma said students reaching their full potential with extra support was a super positive thing that comes from inclusive classrooms, and I totally believe this. I taught in a middle school, and I taught students with behavior disorders, like I said, in a middle school in a self-contained setting, and I can promise you that they did not get the best biology instruction that they could have in a biology classroom. It just was not my area of expertise, and I didn't know that. So when we move kids into inclusive settings, they get the benefit of having someone with expertise in the subject that they're teaching, which is a huge benefit. Along with that, Jacqueline talked about the importance of differentiating instruction. So it's a benefit for all the students in the classroom. If there is a special ed teacher in the classroom who knows how to differentiate, if this gen ed teacher can learn how to differentiate, then that works for all students, not just students with disabilities, because students learn differently. Austin talked about that being a problem as a first-year teacher to know how to differentiate, which is true across a lot of teachers. It's super important that you learn how to differentiate instruction because it's not easy. It's not an easy thing to do. So I'm really hoping you'll learn that from this course. A couple of you guys talked about peer tutoring, and I just wanted to mention that peer tutoring is an evidence-based practice. We know it works, but we also know that it has to be implemented the way it's written and designed to be implemented. So again, referencing back to Austin, he talked about his students actually making fun of other students making fun, that's not the language he used, but laughing at other students who were they were trying to work with. And then we had other people talk about that it was actually a positive because their students were compassionate. So when we start learning how to differentiate instruction, it's important to learn how to teach the other students in the classroom how to deal with our students with EBD. So yeah, that's a big deal. Even our students with learning disabilities, kids have a tendency to not understand what's going on. So it's almost like a life lesson for them to learn to be compassionate and understanding and empathetic. And I've seen it happen in inclusive classrooms, but it has to be taught. Just like we teach academics, we teach behavior of the students without disabilities and the students with disabilities. Again, you guys mentioned that it was important for students to be given access to challenging material. That goes back to my biology story. It is important that that we don't water down the curriculum while we're dealing with behavior or while we're dealing with a learning disability. We can teach students with disabilities the content, as long as we know how to differentiate and keep them engaged in the instruction and learning. It's not about just having them in the classroom. Okay, my computer went to sleep while I was talking. That was different. So yes, so that's a con. I mean, that's a pro. It's really important for students to learn how to work with different types of people, right? And they learn that, I think. The cons are the distractions. And I think I mentioned that my area of expertise is EBD, and my students are the ones that are distracting the other students in the classroom. I've heard a lot of people talk about students with ADHD. In fact, some of you guys wrote about that, and we have some parents of children with ADHD in this class. And students with ADHD can be distracting. So there's a couple of things that you'll learn through the course about how to handle that. For one thing, we can teach students with ADHD how to not be distracted, how to remain engaged, how to participate in class, and we can also come up with ways, or we know there are ways that teachers can help the students other than constantly prompting, right? Another con that you guys talked about was, this was a theme throughout all of your discussions, about the gen ed teacher and the special ed teacher working together. That's big. It really is. It's almost like a marriage in a classroom. So if the special ed teacher and the gen ed teacher don't work well together, then it's not going to work. You have to learn to work together. So we'll talk about, or you'll read about collaboration and how to learn to work together when you disagree. There's also, you'll read about 6 different models of inclusive teaching, of co-teaching. One of you guys mentioned, I'm not going to be able to find it, but one of you guys mentioned, it was Loma, mentioned that she had a great, Loma, you mentioned that you had a great working relationship with your inclusive teacher, with your inclusion teacher. And Chetna actually thought that was a great idea. We all think it's a great idea. I have watched teachers teach together that were like clockwork. And I've also watched a special ed teacher sit in the back of a classroom and draw football plays, which is not helpful, right? I've also seen teachers take all of our special ed students and work at a table with them and not integrate into the classroom. That's not what inclusion's about either. So you'll learn those things in the course, and so I'm glad that you've already recognized that that's important and not an easy thing always to do. Christina also mentioned that the perfect model of co-teaching was both teachers teaching, which I agree with. So instead of the special ed teacher being the resource in the classroom, the special ed teacher can also teach, right? So if we're teaching a lesson, I'll teach part, you teach part. I've actually done this in a university classroom with my colleague, and it works well because we both explain things different, and we both come from different backgrounds, and we both have different areas of expertise. So if the special ed teacher's there, and she can bring knowledge and experience to all the kids in the classroom, not just the special ed classrooms. That's pretty much what you guys talked about. There was a lot of discussion, like I said earlier, about how difficult it is to differentiate instruction. So I'm hoping you'll learn that in this course, and you'll learn from each other, and you'll learn from me. And I look forward to any questions that you have. Feel free to email me. That's it for tonight. So have a good week, and you'll see me next week. Good night.